Dark Souls is one of the greatest games ever made. It's also one of the worst games ever unleashed upon the world. Now, of course, I don't mean that it's bad in any capacity. The game has flaws, that's for sure, but it's by no means a terrible game. Rather, the reason why I love it so much but hate what it caused is because of the immeasurable damage, so to speak, that it wreaked upon the by now genre of difficult games. With the advent of Dark Souls' sudden surge in popularity following its 2011 release in the West, there came a series of increasingly ridiculous comparisons hot on its heels, with games trying desperately to be the next absurdly difficult but rewarding game, whilst entirely missing the whole point of Dark Souls itself. The Souls series fell prey to its own hubris after a while. Whilst it has its merits, I dislike Dark Souls 2, and the third game is certainly a thing that exists, and it's good fun as long as you divorce it from its forefather. But this definitely wasn't helped by the birth of the term Souls-like. Every game that was ostensibly just a mildly difficult RPG with what was, up until that point and well after, fairly standard and well-established RPG design decisions, upgrade paths, branching pathways, customization options, a hub world, and so on, suddenly it became branded a Souls-like, or a game that bore a passing resemblance to Dark Souls in the same way this piece of toast bears a passing resemblance to Jesus. And since the Souls games were so successful and the nature of their gameplay was shockingly simple once you got past the veneer of angry death rants, it wasn't long before those so-called Souls-like games started to brand themselves as such, attempting to cash in on the fervour. Of particular note was the exaggerated use of the phrase "the Dark Souls of something," to the extent that it now has its own Know Your Meme page, and there is a dedicated individual on Twitter who shows us just how ridiculous this phrase has become. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater feels like the Dark Souls of skateboarding. Donkey Kong is the Dark Souls of platformers. Shin Megami Tensei is the Dark Souls of Persona. That one is the absolute worst, considering that Persona is a bloody spin-off of the mainline SMT games, and the first SMT predates even King's Field by a good 10 years. Jesus Christ. Anyway, the point is that Dark Souls became a meme long before its sequels gave us memeable fan service and even lived long enough to call itself the villain. But despite the absolute travesty of gaming journalism that were following its wake, what many people don't really understand even now is perfectly encapsulated by Shammy. Games like Dark Souls and The Binding of Isaac and other difficult games aren't good because they're hard, they're good because they're challenging, and there is a strong difference between something being difficult and something being challenging. Difficulty is one of those often maligned aspects of video games where those who have an opinion on the matter have a very strong opinion. People wanted easier modes in the Souls games, and whilst the argument was made that lowering the difficulty would detract from the game's intent of reward through suffering, I find it's easier to live a lovely, comfortable life if you stop caring how other people play their games and just kinda let them get on with it. For me, personally, whilst I love the challenging nature of Dark Souls and Isaac, I primarily play games to have fun, and when given the choice will tend towards normal difficulty in games out of a distinct desire to not have to worry about boredom bred by having to repeat sections over and over again. Death in Dark Souls is treated as a learning curve. In many other games, it's more of a mild inconvenience. They say familiarity breeds contempt, and honestly there's no greater incident of that than in the slew of memes that Dark Souls birthed. So after spending nearly 700 words waffling on about how Dark Souls is simultaneously the best and worst thing ever, let's shift gears and talk about one of those so-called Souls-like games, Hellpoint. Released following a successful Kickstarter campaign in August 2020, Hellpoint is a hack-and-slash sci-fi RPG with a steep learning curve, customizable gear and stats, punishing enemies and minimal cutscenes, with a healthy dose of cosmic horror and mild Lovecraftian vibes thrown in for good measure. Its plot is largely told through brief interactions with NPCs who drift in and out of the game at their leisure, lore dumps from notes and terminals scattered around the world, and the occasional discussions with an ominous overseer of the space station that you find yourself trapped within. Said station is currently slowly orbiting around a black hole, and it doesn't take long to realise that something terrible has occurred here. The station was once seemingly a paradise for humanity, the beginning of a new era, but time and tide and enormously powerful entities with varying numbers of appendages have decimated the station, transforming it into a haven for monstrosities and the hollowed shells of the humans once meant to usher in a brave new future. You are a spawn of a being calling itself the Author, who awakens you from a pod to request that you assist in gathering data around the station, so that they can understand precisely what has happened, what is causing their mysterious illness, and perhaps find a way to fix it. The voice leads you into an area known as the Embassy and instructs you to meet them at a terminal a short distance away. And that's it. You're free to potter about to your heart's content. From the off, Hellpoint feels relatively tight and responsive, with smooth, fluid movements for the most part, and the godfather of all Souls-like game mechanics, a dedicated jump button. I cannot stress how much this simple addition matters in a game like this, where verticality is suddenly brought to the fore, allowing for platforming puzzles that present unique, dangerous, and often infuriating challenges, with many of the levels offering incredibly well hidden and complex alternate pathways and an abundance of secrets to find. It's fairly easy to dismiss a dedicated jump as a feature that's just a no-brainer. But then I remember how you jumped in the original Dark Souls and my eyes start to bleed for some reason. There's a reason they gave you the option to change the button mapping for the jump in the remaster. For a low-budget indie game, Hellpoint also has a strong visual aesthetic. It looks fantastic, and whilst the fact that this is a space station might limit its ability to have the range of varieties other RPGs may offer, the game is no less a visual smorgasbord even with the restricted set pieces. Many of the upper tier areas of the station, such as the Arisen Dominion, are wreathed in gold and adorned with ridiculous statues, clearly designed with pomp and zealotry in mind, whereas the depths of the station bear witness to Stone City, a slum-like area where rotting corpses and mounds of rubbish are piled high in every corner, and the air is thick with a tar-like smog. Cityscapes in the far distance are a persistent and gorgeous reminder of the sheer enormity of the station, and whilst you won't be able to visit every part of it, as some of the backgrounds are just there for visual flair, the scope and scale of Hellpoint is impressive by its own merits, not least for the fact that this is the first game developed by a team who have existed for just over 5 years, reliant on the goodwill of the public with their crowdfunding campaign. Whilst it's abundantly clear that the Souls generation of gaming has provided plenty of inspiration, being a dark and difficult action RPG set in an unforgiving universe, the game has plenty of its own value that, for the developer's first game, is far more impressive than the initial attempts of developers like Greedfall's Spiders, a team so tone-deaf that Bound by Flame is simultaneously hilariously good fun and horrifically badly designed, or Deck 13's first attempt on one of the earliest games to capitalise on the success of Dark Souls, with Lords of the Fallen, a game where the main character has such a unique centre of gravity that no matter which class you choose when you begin, you'll always be slow as shit. And honestly, looking at the critical reception to Hellpoint, I feel it's been criminally hard done by. It flew under the radar enough that I thought it was released this year, and even now it's barely scraped 50 total critic reviews across all platforms, with a Metacritic rating of 64 and a Steam review score of the mid to high 70s. To be fair, the game does have some problems, just a few, a small shopping list of issues you might say, but let's not dwell on those just yet. Let me regale you with tales of what the game does well first. As a quote-unquote Souls-like, the basic premise is simple. You have a light attack and a strong attack, you can dodge, run about like a lunatic, parry and make use of a variety of weapons, equipment and consumables to increase your strength and your ability to destroy things efficiently. You level up by collecting Axions, which can either be found as a consumable item or acquired by defeating enemies and bosses. You then level up by infusing Axions at a breach, a tear in the fabric of reality that serves as your miniature hub for the area you're in. Most areas will have multiple breaches, with some very well hidden throughout the level to encourage exploration. Although you can teleport between breaches, only specific ones will allow you to do so immediately, typically those left behind once major bosses are defeated. If you want to make another breach accessible by teleportation, you need to find breach synchronizers, which are scattered throughout the station and in quite short supply. As a result, it's often best to thoroughly explore an area beforehand rather than just synchronizing a breach straight away, as it's not always the optimal strategy to go for the first ones you find. This is a mechanic I very much appreciate, as it's often been said that allowing you to teleport between any bonfire immediately in both Dark Souls 2 and 3 somewhat dissuaded you from bothering to explore properly. Being limited in when and where you can fast travel largely negates the issues caused by just being able to jump around at will, and especially considering the decision of which breaches to synchronize is left up to the player, meaning that if you choose poorly, you're stuck dealing with the consequences of your actions. As is expected, you have access to a small supply of healing items from the start, which restock when you die, but the way Hellpoint approaches this is a little different to most other action RPGs. You're given 2 healing injectors at the start of the game, and when you use them, this little red bar at the bottom of the screen will change hue and deplete. If you proceed to go ham on some enemies, you'll notice that the bar will start to fill up again. Damage enough enemies and you'll get one of your 2 heals back. Similar to the regain mechanic in Bloodborne, this encourages you to play aggressively, trading blows on the understanding that doing so will allow you to heal. You don't have to kill enemies to fill up the bar either, simply damaging them with melee attacks will do the trick. The caveat is that only melee attacks will do this. Guns, catalysts or other methods of dealing damage won't fill up the bar, so you can either act extremely aggressively and concentrate on melee, where you're more likely to take damage but can also heal a lot faster, or pick off enemies from afar and avoid damage as much as possible. It's an interesting dichotomy, although given just how much damage some enemies do, it doesn't always feel like the game has been properly balanced for this mechanic, especially in the case of certain boss fights. You can of course upgrade the number of heals you have by finding healing proficiencies, items that are often well hidden throughout the levels. You can then upgrade your injectors or other healing items that can be found throughout the game with varying effectiveness. And your ability to build up a healing charge will then max out at 3, 4 or however many you happen to find. Just remember that connecting to a breach does not restore your healing items, only death, aggressive melee attacks or fully refilling your stock at a healing station will do this. The biggest downside to this is that your base injector stock is always 2 and it is currently not possible to upgrade this at all. You can stack heals like a madman, but if you die you lose all of the ones you accumulated and go right back down to 2. Whilst it makes sense in theory, it can be a little frustrating if you just refilled your health stock, teleported back to fight a boss and then died on the run to a grumpy enemy or a dodgy platforming section. The other slight aggravation to this is that if you fully restock your heals then have to quit out of the game for whatever reason, when you load back in you will load back in with just 2 again, which is infuriating considering that the game doesn't pause, so if you're a busy little beaver who happens to have an important phone call or a pipe bursts in your house or the cat decides the power cable needs a good chewing, you're going to lose any heals that you just paid for and you won't get the actions back. You'll start in a fairly confined area with base stats, but levelling up quickly in the early game is quite easy, allowing you to begin crafting a character that suits your desired playstyle, and once you leave the embassy and enter the observatory, which functions as the game's central hub, you'll start to find a variety of options for exploration. If you find the appropriate key, you can enter Portis Sodun extremely early in the game, eschewing archaeology for a much more difficult but rewarding path, or you can go the way the game intends for you to go. The further through the station you traverse, the more paths open up for you, and it's entirely possible to visit 4 or 5 completely different areas without ever actually fighting a single boss if you wish to. Some areas can't be accessed without a key or an item from another place, and some of these keys are only dropped by bosses, but there are a hell of a lot of secrets in the game, many of them providing brand new pathways to other areas, and it allows for a much grander state of exploration than many of these types of games tend to offer so early on. Massively assisting in this is the fact that as you progress further through the game, areas you have and haven't visited will be repopulated with different, often much stronger enemies, so if you start a new game and choose a different path, you'll see different enemies to those you previously fought if you visited that same area at a much later point in the game. Due to this, it rarely feels like it's necessary to grind for levels, as the enemies grow stronger with you and provide more items and more actions accordingly. It's a great little system, and one that caused a lot of horrified confusion when I returned to an earlier area and realised there was a giant scythe-wielding woman where there had previously been a dainty little skeletal man. One of the game's other mechanics is a slight encouragement to making the player adapt their playstyle and make use of a variety of weapons and armour sets depending on the enemies and bosses at hand. Many of the enemies deal one type of the game's elemental effects: radiation, nil, entropy, energy and induction. Nil and energy are essentially analogous to dark and light types, while induction is fire damage and entropy can be considered a withering force, or more aptly, death. The player can also acquire weapons that deal elemental damage, and it can be applied to melee weapons as well, although I personally would recommend that you maintain a purely physical melee weapon and make use of a catalyst or gun to deal elemental damage, as striking that balance between the two will make a good chunk of the game's bosses an absolute piece of piss, given that most of them are weak to some form of elemental damage. Aside from all of this, whilst the game doesn't necessarily flaunt its story, it offers plentiful lore dumps for those who genuinely want to know exactly what happened on the Irid Novo station. There are libraries, dossiers, computers, scattered documents, hurriedly written messages daubed in interesting fluids on the walls, and each provides a small percentage of knowledge towards the author's request for you to acquire 100% data. However, inspecting these isn't necessary for achieving the 100% data requirement to reach the final area of the game, as there are 3 main bosses that will each provide you with 33%, and the remaining 1% is easily acquired just by locating breaches, which also provide around 0.67% data. In fact, if you commit to getting as much data as possible, the author will attempt to rush you towards the end game, slightly suggesting that they aren't as benevolent as they may first appear. With the collection of data being your primary goal, as it were, the core of the game is wrapped around assuming that you're going to go out there and kill things, and it works very well. There's no useless guff, although there are a small number of NPC side quests that you can engage in, some of which can affect the ending you receive, and with how fast and fun the combat can be and how easy acquiring data is, you'll likely not even think about the fact that that's what you're doing for the author until he actively contacts you to congratulate your progress. It's a simple premise, and for the cost of entry there is a lot of content here, much more than I expected, and with the addition of player interactivity in the form of cryptic notes left as handprints on the environment and a PvP arena, there is enough to slake the thirst of those of you who want to hash it out with other spooky-looking semi-humans. And despite prattling on for so long, I still haven't covered all this game has to offer. There are curious, ominous monoliths dotted around the various areas that, when activated, teleport you to a mirrored dark version of the area that you're in, usually a little more confined, in which you can scavenge for nil rocks used for upgrading, fight special enemies and bosses, and in specific areas speak to one of the 3 cosmic gods that rules over the station. You can't fight them in the underworld, but you can make a deal with them that allows you to complete some fun side quests for extra loot before you actually deal with them properly. The game features some neat little puzzles in the form of eye codes that correspond to a series of towers you need to locate and, in one instance, properly activate, where you can then enter the code combinations to open up secret doors that you can find in hidden corridors of the station. The codes aren't prompted on screen, you have to search for them and jot them down, very traditional, and make sure that you use the correct combination of codes together to open the doors. Oftentimes you'll find extra items, enemies or bosses that offer fun little detours on the grander path. There are also areas of the station where you can head out into space, and unless you want to die extremely quickly of radiation damage, you'll need to find both the damaged spacesuit and the corresponding model or blueprint to fix it before you can do so. One external area in particular is a tiny puzzle in itself and is good fun to navigate. The only problem is that the spacesuit is heavy, so you'll want to make sure you upgrade your equipment load either by leveling it up or making use of a particular module you can find in the game. Speaking of, I haven't even mentioned modules yet. Your character has 3 additional slots in their inventory, the body module, the mind module, and the omnicube. The first 2 can be augmented with various items that you find around the station, giving you extra health, extra carrying capacity, upping one of your skills by a fairly substantial amount, and they can be swapped out at your leisure. The omnicube is a tool that you can equip with 3 separate skills, such as an overhead light, handy for the game's numerous dark, dingy areas, the ability to walk back to the last breach, and more. All of these can provide you with powerful boons when combined, and they can also be ignored completely. Alongside this, one small thing worth mentioning is that the game quietly encourages you to swap weapons on the fly by using a simple mechanic with regards to equipment load. You have 3 slots for your main hand and 3 for your offhand, with the latter typically being used for your catalysts, guns and shields. However, unlike the Souls and similar games where equipment load is based on everything you have attached to your person, whether you're using it or not, Hellpoint's equipment load is based on what you're currently holding in each hand combined with your current armour weight. So if you're holding a glaive and a catalyst and moving slowly, you can swap to a different offhand weapon and suddenly move much faster. This adds an extra layer to combat that makes it far more fluid and dynamic than I ever expected it to be, and honestly, I'm impressed. And I haven't even broached the fact that there's a fairly robust crafting mechanic in the game. The station is littered with blueprints that can be brought back to various crafting stations, with some of the more demonic weaponry needing to be crafted at an occult station, whereas the more human weaponry, as it were, can be crafted at a tech station. Many enemies will drop crafting items, or they can be found naturally throughout the world, and you can either build certain items from scratch or upgrade existing weaponry, such as the antiquated glaive, to create a stronger, better version of it. This sometimes comes with a caveat, such as increasing the stats required to wield these items, which the game will tell you before you confirm the creation of it, but many of the weapons and armour this applies to can be found at least twice throughout the station, so if you don't like the new item you crafted, you may very well find the original in another part of the station, if you're willing to look for it. And it just occurred to me as I draw nearer to completing this script that I never even mentioned the black hole mechanic, so here I am, in the future, popping back in to slot this neatly in between two utterly unrelated things. So in the top left corner of the game, you'll notice what appears to be a space-age sundial, and once each rotation for around 10 minutes real time, it will glow a vibrant orange and things will start to get a little shaky around the station. During this time, certain areas will be blocked by a golden wall, and once you enter, you'll find yourself in a mob rush, where defeating the enemies during the black hole time will net you some nice prizes. Aside from this, regular enemies will be supplemented with much stronger ones during the time frame, and defeating them will provide you with far more actions than normal, as well as rarer crafting materials and items. The mechanic would be a little easy to forget about if it didn't make the entire space station shiver every few seconds, and it's likely you'll stumble across these mob rush areas a few times before you realise what causes them, but they are a fun detour from the rest of the game. Last but not least, because if I go on and on any more about the great aspects of this game, I'll forget that we need to talk about the negatives. There is also an interesting weapon familiarity system that naturally increases your efficiency and proficiency with your chosen armaments over time. Weapons will have a single slot for an upgrade in them, usually a conductor or catalyst that can provide a base increase to damage and be upgraded to the next level via a weapon workbench, but using them frequently provides similarly great benefits. For example, using the catalyst will unlock new abilities which can be accessed by holding left on the D-pad and choosing an alternative firing mode, as it were. For daggers, you can unlock a backstab that is slow and precise but deals massive damage on unaware enemies, and for swords or similar you can unlock the ability to temporarily buff your weapon with an element of some kind. The more your familiarity grows, the greater the rewards, with certain weapons providing buffs to your stamina, energy bar, which is required for catalysts and guns, or boosting one of your skills when the item is equipped. And believe me, some of the alternative fire modes for the channeler catalysts in particular are insanely powerful. Wrapping your head around all these little bits and pieces that aren't necessarily well explained in the game can be a little overwhelming, but ignoring them will absolutely make the game far more difficult. My first run of the game was unnecessarily gimped by my refusal to use any guns or catalysts until I realised that many bosses were absurdly weak to induction. On my second playthrough I utilised the Channeler of Hell, which shoots fireballs that deal damage over time as well as an AoE, and was shocked by how much easier the game became. One of the Cosmic God bosses was hilariously weak to induction to the extent that I tried and failed 5 times to fight him in melee, before absolutely butchering him with induction damage. My strongest advice? Invest in a catalyst. It will be well worth it, unless you're determined to experience the game as a purely melee build. The challenge is certainly there, but fair word of warning, there is one boss in particular that is a nightmare to fight in melee. We'll get to that. So about those negatives then, the first thing I absolutely have to stress is this. Do not play this game on the PS4 if you have the option not to. I can't speak for the Xbox version, but the PS4 game suffers from lengthy load times, poor frame rate, stuttering, VSync issues and general lag, hitbox recognition problems, input lag and some incredibly amusing glitches. If you have the choice, play the game on PC. I've experienced no glitches, a perfectly smooth frame rate, all the usual that you would expect, and yes, I'm aware this is a well duh, everything's better on PC moment, but Hellpoint isn't exactly a visually taxing game. There's hardly an abundance of particle effects that could be causing the performance problems, so the fact that there's such a huge difference in performance between the two is startling. Don't get me wrong, the game is still enjoyable on PS4, but the hitbox issues especially were a huge problem on the console, with strikes that should have hit simply gliding straight through the enemies and myself being struck by enemies who were nowhere near me. You know, the Dark Souls 2 style of hitboxes. I guess the takeaway is that Hellpoint's PS4 version is the Dark Souls 2 of Souls-like games. Beyond the performance problems on consoles, Hellpoint's biggest issues are threefold, starting build variety, platforming and level design, for a few specific areas. There will be some spoilers for the mid to late game in this section, so if you'd rather not hear it, there will be timestamps annotated on screen. Otherwise, let's start with the build variety. When you begin Hellpoint, you're provided with a generic human. There are no character customization options, which is a shame but makes perfect sense in the context of the world, and all of your stats begin at 1. There's no starting build variety, which is a massive issue for replayability, since unless you know specifically what to look for and where it is in the game's opening area, the embassy, your run to and the fight with the first boss will be almost exactly the same every time you play a basic new game. and I can see this being off-putting to players who enjoy the pros and cons of choosing a character that has been spec'd for a particular playstyle. The character of the spawn is intended to be a blank slate, and this isn't really an issue for me, but the one thing that is a problem off the back of this is that there's no ability to respec your character. Throughout the game, unless I have severely missed something, there is no item that lets you reset your stats at all, meaning that if you make poor decisions in the opening area, like I did the first time, or simply don't understand all the game's mechanics like most people will the first time, you might end up ignoring stats that could prove extremely useful later. Compounding this is the fact that the Embassy has a very limited array of weaponry, and you can't even acquire a full suit of armour until you actually beat the first boss, whereupon you'll reach the Observatory, the game's hub. The other weapons that you can acquire in the Embassy require hugely inflated skill stats, particularly in strength, that would take the patience of a saint to acquire if you were truly hankering to use the column or the heavy burden that badly right from the off. But pumping the 23 extra levels in strength you need to use the heavy burden will be a massive detriment to literally every other stat, since the game is much closer to the Bloodborne and Dark Souls 1 style of leveling, where you'll likely finish the game somewhere around the level 60 to 70 mark, due to the natural increase of the level requirement for Axions. With the lack of starting build variety, this means you need to know what you want to do right from the off, which is next to impossible for a new player without serious research first. And it's very easy to ignore cognition and foresight completely, since you can't actually get any of the more interesting and unique catalysts or guns until after you leave the Embassy. This is such a strange design choice, and I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of making the opening hours so stonewalled was. The way the Embassy and the character are designed means that most people will be beating the first boss using the pipe, and possibly, if you're canny or spend 3 seconds googling the personal ID codes for the game, the Kickstarter railgun, since they have the lowest starting requirements for the kind of weapons they are. Hell, the pipe is the first weapon you're given, and many people will likely shape their build around that on the assumption that it can be respec'd later. Which it can't. Then there's the platforming. I hate platforming in these kind of games, but harbour a begrudging acceptance of it being necessary to shake up the levels a little and give you some extra nooks and crannies to explore for goodies. It's rare that platforming is a necessity in the game, but when it is needed it can be a massive ball ache. The problem I have with the way your jump works is that it feels extremely heavy, and aiming and completing a jump feels almost like trying to land an aeroplane with 2 numb hands. You have to control your jumps in the air, pushing forward on the stick until you're above the platform you're aiming for, then making sure to release the stick, otherwise you'll overshoot the jump and sail merrily into the abyss. This means that if you release the stick too soon, you can and will plummet to your death, although bizarrely, if you release and then readjust the stick while still in midair, you'll start to move forward again. Imagine you're controlling a jetpack, as you can adjust your angle and trajectory at will, but at the same time, jumps are tricky little buggers in that some of them require a standing jump and others require a running jump. You remember the early Tomb Raider games, how some jumps needed a single block's worth of run-up, whereas others could be made just by standing at the very edge of a platform and making a single bold leap? Hellpoint's jumps function like that, with the added extra of punishing you on occasion if you have the hubris to use the wrong jump. If you use a running jump to cross a gap that the game has arbitrarily decided doesn't need a gentle jog to warm up, you will smack into either an invisible wall, the roof of the platform if it has one, or just sail straight over it, no matter how much you try to fine motor control your way to safety. Other times, you can and will bounce off walls for no apparent reason, and these are the only times when death really feels deeply unfair. The platforming is nowhere near tight enough to be used as frequently as it is, and whilst thankfully it's only a requirement in a few areas, one of these areas is the exterior of the space station leading to a boss. It is not a pleasant section at all if you have any problem with depth perception, like I do. Which brings me nicely onto level design. There are a few specific areas of the game that I want to point out as being the lost isolith of Hellpoint in more ways than one. Archaeology Underside, specifically the SAS breach and the transporter boss, and the Arisen Dominion. I'll start with the latter because it's the less infuriating of the two. The Arisen Dominion is an area that can be accessed at around the midpoint of the game, depending on the paths you take through the various areas of the station, and whilst it looks gorgeous, it is a total nightmare to navigate. Many of the rooms and corridors look strikingly similar, with numerous hidden and obvious branching pathways, making it very easy to lose track of where you came from and where you need to go. With the way that enemy respawns work in this game, you might find yourself clearing a room, running off in one direction and spending some time poking around to look for any hints of how to progress. By the time you go back the way you came, the enemies have respawned, and the sameness of the environments make the mantra, "If you're finding enemies, you're going the right way," a deeply unfunny joke. Combine this with the fact that sometimes unlocking a shortcut is not guaranteed to mean it stays open, which may or may not be a glitch, I'm not sure. But that means that you may very well be spending an awful lot of time repeating the same steps if you're struggling with the enemies in the area, who can deal a lot of damage very quickly, or heaven forbid, the platforming. The area itself is full of fascinating lore, and one of the game's most interesting NPCs, who has always without fail been stuck right here on these stairs running in circles instead of wherever on Earth he is supposed to be. But the way it's been designed, with the lavish upper class of the Arisen flaunting their wealth and vibrancy accordingly, makes this one of the most annoying areas in the game, purely from an exploration point of view. However, for the crowning achievement in absolute bullshittery, the Arcology Underside takes this to the extreme with the Transporter boss, more specifically with the way that you access the Transporter boss. This can be considered a mid-game spoiler, so I will put a timestamp on screen for you to avoid it. This boss and the way that you approach him is one of the worst pieces of level design I have ever seen. The actual route itself is fine, it's one of those aforementioned spacewalks that have an excellent sense of scope and scale, with some gorgeous backdrops and pleasing level verticality despite the platforming issues that I have. However, the boss at the end of this area is one of the worst designed enemies in the game, with the absolute pinnacle of its hitbox issues in its fast, furious movements and minuscule boss room, where it is extremely easy to get caught on parts of the scenery. The room being so small is one thing, but then the boss has a tremendous reach and a leaping attack that can and will teleport you into it, whilst its actual moveset isn't too much of an issue after a while, and may in fact be fairly easy to cope with in any other situation. It does have one particular flurry of blows that is around 5 to 6 extremely fast, hard-hitting attacks, and they will kill you if you're caught by any one of them. The biggest issue that compounds this, however, is that the closest breach to this boss is outside the arena, in space, meaning that if you die, you are respawned outside the space station, which means that unless you are astoundingly confident that you will not die, then you have to wear the spacesuit for the entire fight, or the radiation damage will decimate your health bar the instant you respawn. And just to rub salt in the wound, the spacesuit weighs a metric ton, so unless you have heavily invested in upgrading your equip load stat, you will have to use the anti-gravity body module that gives you a large boost to said stat, or you'll not have the necessary freedom of movement to adequately dodge the transporter's attacks. This is the only part of the game that I would say is truly appalling in its design, and I only bothered to do this boss on the PC version of the game purely because I needed the footage for this segment of the video. Thankfully, the transporter boss is entirely optional, as you can actually acquire the item it drops, which is the Porter Sodun credentials, much earlier in the game, long before you can even enter the Arcology Underside. So if the thought of this boss brings you out in hives, you'll be happy to hear that you can find a copy of the credentials here in the embassy instead. Do this. Kill the transporter for the trophy if you really must, but it is not worth the effort to go out of your way to do so. There is also one other major design flaw that I struggle to find a reason for, and this one requires a major spoiler warning as it spoils the true final boss of the game. If you don't want to see it, skip to the annotated timestamp. The true final boss is accessed by completing the Architect NPC's side quest, and it is a being known as a Sentient. Once you reach the Author, who turns out to be a mass AI branded in his dedicated boss battle as the interface, you'll defeat him and be provided with a breach that, when you connect to it, teleports you to the Sentient boss fight. The battle begins almost immediately, the boss is miles away, and you need to sprint up to him, dodging some thoroughly irritating AoE attacks before you can even think about hitting him. And if you also completed the Prodigal Spawn NPC's quest, you'll have to contend with him as well in this fight. And once you reach the Sentient, you'll realise very quickly that he is miserably resistant to melee attacks. Induction is your best friend here. Induction is permanently your best friend. I guess Hellpoint's name is somewhat appropriate since you'll be setting everything on bloody fire. All of this wouldn't be as big an issue as it is were it not for one thing. You cannot leave this fight. At all. Not using any normal in-game method at least. Once you connect to that breach, which is the only breach in the entire game that teleports you somewhere else upon use, you are forced into this fight and you cannot leave the boss arena. If you die in the fight, you respawn in the boss arena and the fight begins again immediately, and of course, this means that you will only respawn with your 2 basic health injectors with no way to refill them. The only way to leave the arena is to actively quit out of the game, following which you will be unceremoniously plonked next to the nearest breach. For the life of me, I cannot understand what prompted this decision. It is one of the most baffling things I have ever seen in a game like this. Hell, even in Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin specifically, where it was entirely possible to end the game by fighting the Throne Watcher and Throne Defender, followed immediately by Nashandra, followed immediately by Aldir, if you died in any of the fights then the game would just respawn you outside the boss room. Beyond this though, there are a few other niggling little issues that are worth mentioning, such as the strange fact that you can and very likely will meet regular mob versions of most of the main bosses before you ever actually reach them. This confused the hell out of me when I first entered Port Isodun and fought one of these guys, only to stumble across his big brother in the Alba Mater Atrium much later on. This isn't a big deal, as other games have done this as well, but they generally wait until you've actually fought the boss in question before they respawn them as ordinary mobs. I suppose you could consider it good practice for the actual bosses themselves, but either way it strikes me as a strange decision. Swings and roundabouts. You can also parry in the game, but there's no actual riposte animation, which is a bit strange. Poise seems to be a thing sometimes, and other times seems to exist on the edge of reality just beyond your grasp. The music is fantastic, but there's nothing more uncanny valley than entering a boss room and having the music just not play. It's incredibly unnerving, which now that I think about it, I suppose might be an ingenious way of freaking you out. There are a handful of NPCs in the game, but they often feel a little token and their associated quests tend to be fairly quick and easy to complete, though they do at least add a little more character and intrigue to the game. And lastly, although I certainly lauded the elemental aspects of this game, induction damage is massively overpowered. I've realised since beginning this script that I just had so much to say with this game that what began as what was supposed to be a short 10-minute video sprawled into this amorphous mass of complex feelings, but I'd like to just revert back around to what I said near the beginning. I truly feel that Hellpoint has been criminally underrated in the 6 months since its release, and personally, the relatively minimal press coverage is a hindrance. There's so much to see and explore and destroy in this game that I was lost in its world despite all the issues I faced in the PS4 version. Swapping over to PC has only solidified my opinion that this game is easily one of the best Souls-inspired games so far. Yeah, there are other games that have deeper mechanics like Nioh, or a grittier, more graphically intensive appearance like Mortal Shell, and there are all those charming, retro-style games like Salt and Sanctuary that offer some truly unique challenges and visuals. But Hellpoint is the first of all those games to truly grab me, and whilst I have some reservations, they are almost entirely negated by the fact that the game's major flaws don't even need to be engaged with at all after the first time. Like forgetting all about Paarl until you're horrendously overpowered, or only finding the stray demon by complete accident or Google, and by extension stumbling across the painted world. There are innumerable little moments in Hellpoint that made me say, wait, was that there before? And, oh, that's what that key is for, or why are there so many orange glowing handprints around this wall? I've hunted for something that gave me the same sense of satisfaction and overwhelming pride in myself that Dark Souls did when I first beat it all those years ago. And Hellpoint? Well, Hellpoint isn't that. My heart was never racing, I never really felt in serious peril once I realised that setting fire to everything was a valid life choice. And the majority of artificial difficulty caused by the poor performance of the PS4 version were resolved once I swapped to PC. If you want something that is truly challenging, give Mortal Shell a try instead. Its console performance is considerably better than Hellpoint, so if you're not a fan of Epic exclusives, then the console is still a viable option. Both games retail at around £25 to £30, and Mortal Shell has a new version coming out soon for the PS5 and Xbox Series XS thing. For the amount of content in both of them, that price is really damn good. I certainly enjoyed Hellpoint enough to purchase it twice, and I look forward to Cradle Games refining their mechanics even further for future releases. For now, I can heartily recommend Hellpoint as not just something to pass the time, but a game to truly sink your teeth into. I love its visual aesthetic. I want more games set in weird hell dimensions that aren't part of the 40k universe. Regardless, I'll be keeping an eye on the future of Cradle games, and I hope I've convinced you to give Hellpoint a shot. If nothing else, it's thoroughly satisfying for the budding pyromaniac within you.